Food in Canada has become much more expensive. According to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, food prices in Canada increased by about 31% between January 2020 and 2025. And Canada wasn't unique. Food prices also rose across other G7 countries. But here's a question. If consumers are paying more for food, are Canadian farmers actually making more money? At first, it might seem obvious. Farmers produce the food, so if food prices goes up, you might expect the farmers to be benefit. But the price we see at the grocery store isn't the same thing as the price a farmer receives. And farmer revenue isn't the same thing as farm profit. Between a farm and a grocery shelf, there is an entire supply chain. Farming, processing, wholesale, transportation, retail, and every stage have its own costs. So to understand what's happening to farmers, we need to look at what happens between the farm gate and the grocery store. Let's start with the food dollar. According to preliminary estimates from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, based on Statistics Canada's 2022 supply and use tables, for every dollar Canadians spend on domestically produced food, about 11 cents went to farming, 23 cents to food processing, 9 cents to wholesale, 7 cents to transportation, 16 cents to retail, and about 6 cents to energy and utilities. Restaurants are excluded from this calculation. Now, the 11 cents goes to farmers might look surprisingly small, but there's an important distinction here. These numbers are not profit margins. They represent a share of consumer spending associated with different stages of the food supply chain. For example, food processing accounts for about 23 cents, but that doesn't mean the processors are making 23 cents in profit. Processors also have to pay for ingredients, packaging, labor, energy, equipment, and other operating costs. The same is true for transportation and retail. So this isn't simply a story about who is taking the biggest piece of pie. It is a story about how costs accumulate as food moves through the supply chain. And that distinction matters when we're talking about farmers. Because farmers are in a somewhat different position from many businesses. For major commodities, farmers are often price takers. The market largely determines the price. A wheat farmer, for example, usually can't simply decide, my production costs went up, so I'm going to charge 20% more. The price they receive can be influenced by global supply and demand, weather, trade, currency, geopolitical events, and the commodity markets. So farmers often have a limited control over the selling price, but they still have to pay the cost of production, seed, fertilizer, fuel, machinery, land, labor, interest, crop protection products, and other inputs. This creates a different kind of business problem. A farmer may have limited control over the price, while have lots of responsibility for managing costs and risk. Some of these costs can also change quite a bit over time. AAFC estimates that energy accounted for about 6% of farm expenses, while land prices have also been rising quite a bit. So for a farmer, this important number isn't simply the selling price, it's the margin left after the costs of producing that crop. And this is probably the most important distinction in this entire video. Revenue is not the same thing as profit. This also helps explain something that can seem contradictory. Consumers can pay much more for food, while farmers are still facing financial pressure. Why? Because costs are rising throughout the system. For food processors, ingredients and materials account for roughly 17% of total expenses. For transportation, there are fuel costs, labor, repairs, and insurance. And transportation is particularly important in Canada. Transportation represents about 7% of the domestic food dollar, compared with about 4.6% in the United States. Canada is a large country with long distance between many production areas and population centers. So moving food across the country can represent a relatively large part of the final costs. And this is one reason why looking only at the grocery store price doesn't tell us what's happening at the farm level. There can be substantial costs added long before the product reaches the customer. There is another factor worth considering: market concentration. Canada's food system has a relatively small number of large companies operating across important parts of the supply chain. This is particularly visible in grocery retail. The Competition Bureau's 2023 market study found that 5 major grocery chains dominate a large share of Canada's grocery retail market, and the retail landscape has become more concentrated over time. Since 1986, a series of 15 mergers reduced the number of major grocers from 8 to 5. But I think it's important not to jump from the statistic to the conclusion that retailers are responsible for all food inflation. The food system is much more complicated than that. Concentration is one factor, input costs another, transportation is another, global commodity markets another, and consumer demand matters too. So a more useful way to look at this is to look at where costs, risk, and bargain power sit across the food system, and how much value farmers can actually capture. And from a farmer's perspective, that question becomes particularly important. If farmers don't control global commodity prices, and they don't control every stage between the farm and the consumer, what can they actually do? There isn't one answer that works for every farm. A grain farm, a dairy farm, a vegetable producer, and a specialty crop operation all face very different economics. But there are several areas where farmers may be able to improve their position. The first is cost management. The goal isn't simply to produce more, it is to understand whether the additional production actually creates additional profit. For example, if an additional input costs $30 per egg, but only generates $20 worth of additional output, higher yield doesn't necessarily mean higher profit. So the relevant question becomes, what is the return on this input? What is my cost per egg? What is my break-even yield? What happens if the commodity price falls? And how much risk am I taking to achieve this yield? These are agriculture questions, but they are also fundamental business questions. Farmers are often encouraged to increase yield, and the productivity absolutely matters, but higher yield isn't automatically higher profitability. Imagine two farms. Farm A produces 70 bushels per egg, but spends much more to achieve it. Farm B produces 65, but has much lower production costs. Which farm is performing better? The answer isn't necessarily Farm A. The better performing farm may be the one generated the stronger return on the resources being used. And this is why agriculture technology should also be evaluated economically. A new technology might increase the yield. A new input might improve crop protection. A new piece of equipment might save labor. But for the farmer, the important question is ultimately, what does this do to my bottom line? There's another possibility. Can farmers capture more value from what they already produce? That could mean better crop quality, better storage, different timing of sales, specialty markets, direct relationship with buyers, cooperative models, or for some farms, moving further down the value chain through processing or value-added products. For example, instead of selling only a raw commodity, a producer might participate in processing, packaging, or direct-to-consumer sales. But this isn't automatically more profitable. Storage requires capital, processing requires infrastructure, direct marketing requires time and distribution, and moving further down the supply chain also means taking on additional risks. So the key is finding whether the additional return justifies the additional cost and risk. That's ultimately a business decision. This is also where agriculture and agri-food Canada's food strategy becomes relevant. One of the ideas in the strategy is giving farmers more options to sell their products, including more opportunities to sell food closer to where it is produced. It also points towards strengthening domestic processing capacity, and I think the idea of more control is particularly relevant. Farmers can't control everything, but they may be able to gain more control over certain parts of their business. Input efficiency, production decisions, quality, storage, marketing, contracting, and, where the economics make sense, value-added activities. The objective isn't to control the entire food system. It is to have more control over the parts of the business where decisions can actually affect the bottom line. So let's come back to the original question. If food prices are going up, are farmers actually making more money? Not necessarily. Food prices have risen, but the increase in grocery prices is spread across an entire supply chain. At the farm level, farm revenue depends on commodity prices and production volume, but profitability depends on what remains after production costs and financial risks are taken into account. And farmers operate in a system where many of the biggest variables, commodity prices, weather, input costs, trade, and global events, are outside their direct control. So what matters is how value moves through the food system, while costs and risks are concentrated, and how much of that value each participant can realistically capture. For farmers, that means looking closely at margins, managing risk, and finding opportunities to capture more value from what they produce. And that's probably the part of the issue I find most worth exploring. The future of farming isn't necessarily about simply producing more. It is about improving efficiency, managing risk, and capturing more value. Because in the end, farm profitability depends on much more than the price consumers see on the grocery shelf. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and giving it a like. I'll see you in the next one.